Hey everybody, this is Jamie Cross for GameDevTouchPlus.com. I'm a graphic designer and an indie game developer, and I also teach game development using GameSalad at Udemy and Skillshare.com. This is the second episode of building a platformer game using GameSalad, and in this episode we're going to finish building all of the actors needed for the first level of the game, and we're also going to build the level structure for the entire first level of the game. So let's get started. Now we've got a lot of our actors added for the first level of the game, but there's still a few more that we're going to need to add to get everything in there that we're going to need to finish off the first level. So I'm going to add a new actor. What we're going to add now is the background images. There was the space image way in the background, and then there was like a wall image on top of the space, and they were the images that were doing the parallax scrolling during the game, and we're going to add those two elements right now. So I'm going to drag the space graphic on top of that actor. I'm going to call it space background. We need to make some edits to this to make it work properly. In its graphic settings, I want to make sure it's set up to tile horizontally and vertically, because we're going to be dragging that really large to fill the entire background of every level that we make. And under the physics, I'm just going to shut some of this stuff off. I do need to leave it movable because it's going to move left and right on screen to give us the parallax effect. I need to add a couple rules here to make it work properly. First thing we're going to do is check the attribute, game, direction, and when that direction is right, and remember that was set up in the player. When the player is moving to the right, it changes the value of game direction to right. So what we're going to do here, when the player is moving right, we want the space background to move left. And that's what gives the parallax effect. When the background moves in the opposite direction of the player, I'm going to go to behaviors, drag in a move behavior. And because the player is moving right, we want the background to move left. And I don't want it to move left very quickly. I want it to move left slowly because this is all the way in the very distant background. So I want it to move left at a speed of 20. This should actually be 180, not 190. So 180 is directly left. Now I'm going to copy this whole behavior by holding down Option and change this so when game direction equals left, this background is then going to move right, and that's 0. And we still want that to move at the same speed of 20. Now that's it for the space background, but there was the wall background that adds another layer of movement. So I'm going to take this space background, and I'm going to copy that. I'm going to call it wall background. I'm going to go into images. I'm going to find the wall background image right here, drag that in there to replace the space background image. And when I double click it, it's already set up to tile because we had the space background set up to tile. And these behaviors are almost exactly correct because we want the same thing to happen. We want this background to scroll to the left when the player is moving right, and scroll to the right when the player is moving left. But one critical change to make the parallax work properly is we want to change the speed at which the wall moves because it's in front of the space but behind the player. So what you want to do is make it move a little bit faster than the space. So I'm going to set ours to 40 for both the left and the right movement. So now the player will move pretty quickly because that's closest to you. That's the closest item to the camera. And then there's another layer of this wall that will move slower than the player at 40. But then there's even another layer behind that of space that will move even slower. And those layers of movement are what creates the parallax effect. There's going to be a couple more actors to add to the list here for this first level. But before we do that, I want to put in those background images we just made, the background space and the background walls, and get those placed in there and ready to roll. And then we need to add the droid that will cause the player damage, and also just the special effect of the particle effect bubbles rising up out of the toxic waste. But before we do that, let's add the background images. So to add the space background, I'm just going to drag this background right in here. I'm just going to drop it anywhere at the moment. It went over top of our player and everything. And don't forget right now, what we have set up here isn't actually going to be our first level. I'm going to delete this platform down here, and I'm going to move the player who's right now behind the space background. I just built that so we could test the movement of the player, and I could show you how that's working right away. So what we're going to do now is actually start to build the first actual level of the game. So I'm going to double click this space background. And the key here, I double clicked the space background that's on the stage, not the space background that's over here in the inspector. You want to edit this specific instance of the space background, because we're going to edit this to be what we need for our first level. And then when we have a second and third level, we're going to edit those instances to be what we need for those levels. But we're not editing the main prototype actor here in the inspector palette. So I'm going to double click that. And we're not making any changes to these behaviors. If we change these behaviors, we would want to change those back in the prototype actor, not here in the instance. All we're going to change in the instance is the size and the position of this background. So the first thing I'm going to do is change the size of it. I'm going to make the size 5,384 pixels, and I'm going to make the height 813. And that's obviously going to make it really large. And the reason that is it has to cover our entire play area, and then also have enough of the background to the right and the left, so the width of it, to scroll left and right when our player is moving on screen. So I'm going to change the position of that as well to 1,972 and 505. And that's just its XY position on screen. So let's go back and take a look at that. So now when I scroll around our play area, you can see the space background. It extends beyond the stage on the left. And then as I scroll over, it's really long. And it keeps going all the way almost to the edge of our play area. The reason it doesn't extend off the play area is because our level is actually going to end over here, right about in this area. So it doesn't need to extend beyond the whole play area. We're not going to utilize, there's going to be a little bit of extra space over here. Same thing with top and bottom. There's a little bit at the top and a little bit at the bottom. And that's fine because the floors and walls and everything of the level are going to keep the player locked in up here where there's only space background. Down here where there isn't any, the player's never going to see it. So it doesn't really matter. It may look a little goofy in the editor, but in the game it's actually going to be just fine. To add the wall, we're going to do the same thing. I'm just going to drag it in. And that's humongous. We need to make an edit to this. In the wall, under the graphics settings where we have it set to tile, I want to reduce the size of the image that's tiling. So I want to make the tile width 128 and the tile height 256. Let me delete this one. Drag a new one in here. And now instead of one giant piece of this girder, or whatever you want to call it, wall, it has 4 already repeating. So that's a lot smaller. It just looks better. It looks more to scale with our little player. Now, just like the space background, I want to double click this and just change its size and position on screen. We're not going to change the rules, and we're going to be editing the instance, not the prototype, just like the space background. So I want to change the overall size to 5,384. I want to change the height to 640. And then I want to put it positioned on screen at 1970 and 480. In these numbers, there's no calculation or specific math or anything for these. It all depends on the size of my level. So when I made this game for this tutorial, I found these basically by trial and error. I dragged it as big as I needed it and placed it approximately in place on screen, and then I would play test and make sure nothing, showed up incorrectly. So through a little bit of play testing, you come to these numbers. So just like the space background, you can see this extends beyond the play area on the left and extends way over on the right, but there's still some dead space above and below it. Now, one thing we want to do is get these layered correctly. You can see the player character has kind of gone off screen because other things have been placed on top of it. So in the scene, layers, just want to check these. I want to drag the player above everything, and then also drag this metal panel above everything. Put those right there. Now you can see they both show up and exist. What I'm going to do just as a little test, certainly not going to be part of the official level, I'm going to move this up right there. I'm just going to give this a little play test and make sure the parallax effect is working properly before we start to build any more of the level. I'm going to click preview. And now when I move to the right, the background, the space, and the walls should move to the left. And they are. Now when I come back to the left, they move to the right. So you can see that that's working perfectly. This star moves. I'm going to leave the cursor there so you can see that the star does move, but it moves slower than the wall moves. So you get some layering effect there as the elements move around on screen. And that's exactly what you want with a parallax effect. That's just about everything we're going to need to complete the first level of the game. So let's add just the last 2 remaining actors. Like I said, the special effect actor for the bubbles and the evil droid actor. I'm going to go back to the scene. So we're going to add the mean, nasty droid first. Just going to drag the first animation frame of the droid up here into the inspector. That'll make a new actor for us. I'm going to update the name just to mean droid. I'm going to take the -01 off. Let's double click him and make some edits. The first thing I'm going to do, like I usually do, is update its physics. This doesn't really need any physics. I'm going to turn all this off. The density, the friction, and the bounciness all to 0. We definitely want to leave it movable because it's going to move around on screen. And I do want to fix its rotation so it'll always sit on its base. It would never accidentally fall over. Maybe if the player jumped it and hit it, if I didn't fix its rotation, it might fall over. One thing I forgot to do under physics, where I'm fixing its rotation and movable, I want to change its collision shape to circle instead of rectangle. Now I need to add a couple custom attributes here that we're going to use for this droid and for the game. First one I want to add is a text attribute. I'm going to call that direction. And I want that to start as left. So what we're going to set up in the behaviors is this droid will always start moving to the left. Once it reaches its far left position, it'll move back to the right until it reaches its far right position, and then it'll go back to the left and back and forth, back and forth. So it's a patrolling kind of activity this droid's going to have. I need to add a couple real attributes. This is my min. And another one is going to be my max. And these two values are going to control the far left and far right distance it can travel before it starts to move back and forth. I want to add an integer now. I'm going to call this my speed, and that will be how quickly the robot moves on screen. You'll be able to set them up. You could have slow-moving robots, fast-moving robots, but you'll use always this prototype actor, and you can just change these values in here. So you can get a lot of different robots on screen, all using this same prototype robot. Then we need one last real attribute. I'm going to call this distance from player. And we're going to use this to tell the droid when to play its sound and when not to play its sound. So I don't want it playing its sound the entire game. Or if, for example, you had 10 droids on screen, you would hear the audio from all 10 droids even when they're not near you. So it's only going to turn its sound on when it's close enough to the player that the player would hear its sound. So let's get the behaviors in here and get this droid working. I want to animate it first. So I'm going to drag in and animate. Then just drag in the frames of its animation. First one, second, third, and fourth. Now I have those out of order. You can see like 1 yellow light, 3, so they increase. I need to move this frame to here, and now that's in the correct order. Again, I want to click Restore Actor Image when done off. I want to reduce the speed of this one a little bit. I want this to only animate at 5 frames per second. And I do want it to loop, of course, so I'm going to leave that set. Now let's set up its movement so it knows when and where to move on screen. I'm going to add a rule. I'm going to call this check for left movement. And now I'm going to check when it's self-position, so the attribute mean droid position X. I'm going to check for when that's less than or equal to the mean droid's minimum number. So if it's less than or equal to its minimum distance on screen, and minimum, remember, GameSalad starts at the lower left. Let me go back to the scene. GameSalad starts at the lower left down here. This is 0, 0, 0x, and 0y. So to the left is always less, and to the right is always more. That's why the my minimum is the left side, and the my maximum will be the right side. So when its self-position X is less than or equal to its minimum distance, I want to change an attribute. I'm going to change the attribute mean droid direction to right. I'm going to copy this. Just make a little change here. When the self-position X is greater than or equal to mean droid's my max, it's going to change its direction to left. I can close both of those. I'm going to close the animate too so we can get a little bit more on screen. I want to add another rule. And now what this rule is going to do, it's going to check the attribute mean droid direction. And if that direction is left, it's actually going to move this droid to the left. So I want to drag in a move behavior. I want that to move left, which is 180. And the speed it's going to move, you can put an actual number in here, but I want to give the developer an option to have droids moving at different speeds on screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to reference this my speed. So we're going to do mean droid my speed. Now that's only if it's moving left in this otherwise section. If it's not moving left, it has to be moving right. That's the only two options this droid has. So if it's moving left, move it to the left. If self-direction is not left, it must be right. So we're going to update this to move the droid to the right at the same my self speed. So let me show you how that's going to work. I'm going to go back to the scene. I'm going to delete this player for now, because he's just a placeholder really anyway. We were just testing. So let's test this droid so you can understand exactly what's happening. I'm going to drag the droid in. I'm going to place it over here kind of on the left side of the screen. I'm going to double click it and I'm going to check its position. Its X position, let's say that's 70. 70 is going to be close enough. So down here in our custom attributes we added, I'm going to make the minimum setting 70. Let me go back. I'm going to move him over kind of to the far right. Double click it again. Check its X position. Let's say 415 for that. So I'm going to make my max 415. And let's make it move at a speed of 100. Whoops, not 10, 100. Now when I preview this, you know what, let me take this droid, kind of place it in the middle. Now it's going to move left. It hits its minimum distance, it moves back to the right, hits its maximum, and moves back to the left again. And it's moving at a speed of 100. So if I go back to this droid, now you want to be clicking the instance, not the prototype. In the instance, let's make it move fast. Let's make it move 200. I saw its wheel, actually, it was bugging me. It's slightly overlapping the platform below it, so I'm just going to tick that up by 2. Now when I run it, it's going to do the same thing, just much faster. So that's how those droids are going to work once we get them placed in the actual game. Let's go ahead and add the sound to the mean droid, and then that will finish off the mean droid completely. The first thing I need to do for that is I need to have the droid check to see how far from the player it is all the time. So I'm going to use a constrain attribute for that, and I'm going to set this up at the top of all the behaviors so it's always checking its distance first. So I want to constrain the attribute distance from player, and I want to constrain that to the magnitude, and it comes up with x comma y. What I want to do is get rid of the x and replace that x with mean droids position x minus the game player x. And that game player x is one of the attributes we set up at the very beginning of this tutorial to keep track of the player's x location. And then for the y, I want to delete that y and do mean droid position y minus game player y. Let me drag this all the way on screen, and you can see it fills in the parenthesis for you. There's a paren at the beginning and a paren at the end. And what that's going to do is it's going to always keep track of the distance that this droid is from the player. And now we're going to use that in a new rule. We're going to say when the attribute mean droid distance from player is less than 250, we're going to play the mean droid sound. So I want to come down here to a play sound. Just drag that play sound in. And the sound we want to play is called robot. And I want to loop that. So as long as the player is within 250 pixels of this mean droid, it's going to continue to play its sound over and over again. So I'm going to turn on loop. I'm going to drag that right under this constrain attribute. And that completes the mean droid. Now there's one last actor that we need to add for the first level of the game. And what that's going to be the bubble particle effects for this toxic waste. So I'm going to add a new actor. I'm just going to call it bubbles. And this is really just scenery dressing, but it adds a nice little effect to the game. I'm going to double click the bubbles. We're going to make some edits here. Again, I'm going to turn the physics off because this actor is never going to do anything. It's really just a scenery object. I'm going to turn movable off as well. So even though the bubbles move, those are going to be particles spawned from this actor. So the actual actor itself is never going to move. I'm going to change the alpha of this to 0.5. And this is just going to be for your visual cue as you develop the game. And you'll see when we build our first level what I'm talking about. So I'm going to do a change attribute. In the bubbles, color, alpha, I'm going to set that to 0 as soon as the game starts to play. So I'll show you what will happen. If I drag this in here, right now when you're developing, you can see there's a big white square there. But then when you click preview, that white square goes away, and then you don't see it while you're playing the game. But it's for you while you're developing, so you'll know that's where particles are going to spawn from. And to do that, we're going to need to set up some particle effects. To do that, you drag in a particle behavior, right here, drag that in, and there's a bunch of different tabs up here. We're going to go through these and set these up for the bubbles. The number of particles defaults to 20 and the particle startup time defaults to 2 seconds. I'm going to leave those alone, and we're just going to change the particle lifetime here. For the particle lifetime, I'm going to use a random number. So I clicked on the E for the expression editor. From the list of functions, I'm going to choose random, and I want our particle lifetime to vary from 2 to 5 seconds. So 2 is the minimum and 5 is the maximum. Now in the next tab, for velocity and position, we're going to make some edits here. This is the emitter offset. And remember in GameSalad how everything spawns from the center of any given actor? This lets you control where from the center of your actor those particles will emit. So I'm going to use a random number again, and I want it to spawn from -30 to +30 pixels from the actor. I don't want to change the emitting height. You could do that right here if you wanted to. This is horizontal side to side, and this is vertical top to bottom. I don't need to make a change to this for our bubbles. For the direction, I want that to be 90, so they always rise, because the bubbles are going to be rising up out of the toxic waste. Then for the speed, I'm going to use another random number, and I want the speed to vary from a fairly slow 25 pixels to a maximum of 100 pixels. Let's go to the size tab. In the size tab, I do want the size of our particles to change over time. So for the size, again, I'm going to use random. And I want them to be a minimum of 1 pixel up to a maximum of 10 pixels. So that's going to give us a bunch of different bubbles of different sizes. The target size, that's the size it's going to shrink down to over time. I'm going to go with random again. And it could shrink down to nothing, so I'm going to put 0 there. Or it could shrink down as little as 1 pixel. So it could either disappear completely or shrink down to 1 pixel. For the duration, I'm going to set that to 5. And what that does is it's going to take 5 seconds for these particles to change their size. There's just a couple other things to do here. In the color tab, I want to pick a color like a greenish color. Since the toxic waste is a green, I'm going to pick, let me pick something a little darker. I think that'll work fine. You could actually put values in here if you wanted to in the color picker and match the actual green color of the toxic waste. But I'm just going to pick that from the menu. I'm not going to change the color, and I'm going to leave the blending mode to normal. Rotation, we're not going to mess with, because the image that I'm going to use is actually a circle. So on the image tab, I'm going to go under my images, There's an image in here called particle. So I'm going to click that and just drag that right here. You can't really see much because it's basically a white dot. But that's going to be the image that the particle effect uses as its particle. I'm going to go back to our scene. And that's already placed on there. Let me reduce this down a little. There's no reason for it to be so huge. But I'm going to put that right there. And then preview this, and hopefully the particles are going to show up. And there they go. Right now they're rising up out of nothing. But it's working exactly like I wanted it to work. Some are large, some are small, some fade quickly or move slowly. So there's a lot of variety there for one little particle effect. Now that that particle effect is done and the droid is done, we're going to be able to actually build the architecture for our first level and get that all flushed out. We have all the actors we need set up here. Now the next thing we're going to do is build the level. I'm going to delete this stuff, all this test elements here, the particles, the droid, and this platform. Certainly going to leave the background elements, because that's the exact placement we want for this level. So to start the level, the first thing I'm going to do is build out all of the main platforms that the player is going to be walking on or floating on or whatever you want to say he's doing. I guess he kind of floats above the platform on a force field. So I'm going to drag in the metal panel right here. And I'm just going to place it on screen randomly at this point. And I want this to be 10 panels high. Remember how I set it up to tile? So I'm going to drag this until it's about 10 panels high. See what we get here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. One more. 10. Now I could also do that numerically. I drug this so it was 10 panels high. If I wanted to do that numerically, what I would do is double click that actor. And remember how the actor is 64 pixels wide by 64 pixels high. So if I want that to be perfectly 10 perfect squares high, I could make this 640. And it was a little bit off, obviously, as you could see. But now it's exactly perfectly 640 pixels high, which equals 10 squares of the repeating pattern. I want this platform to fall within the boundaries of this background wall actor we had set up. So I'm going to drag that down just a little bit. I'll drag it up just about exactly to the height that's at. And then it extends to the bottom of it as well. I'm going to deselect that. I'm going to go through here and start adding the rest of the floors and walls. Now I know that went by a little fast, so when you make your level in the game, it certainly doesn't have to match this level exactly. If you do want this level, of course it's in the complete game that you downloaded as a reference, so you can check out the actual values and the actual placement of all of these platforms. But for this first level, that is all of the base platforms placed, all of the main floor element that you're going to see in the game. Now we have some special platforms to place and some other elements to place, and as I go through and place those, I'll discuss them a little bit, but I certainly couldn't discuss the placement of every one of these platforms. This video would last forever. As you can see, the backgrounds are a little bit off. The wall isn't extending down to the floor here, so what I'm going to do is fix that, and that's super easy to fix. All I really need to do at this point is drag it down, and now it reaches the floor, and it'll still be fine. It extends beyond the roof or the ceiling up here. And over here on the far right side, this edge is ragged. All of these things don't line up. But that doesn't matter because the player's never going to get that far. We're going to have the door to exit the game right about here. And then the player will be moving to the second level within this long hallway here before it ever reaches this ragged end. So none of this makes any difference. You don't really have to worry about that. So let's place some of those extra elements. First thing I want to do right here is place some toxic waste. So I'm going to grab the toxic waste actor and drag that in. I'm going to drop that right about here. And again, you could do these numerically if you wanted to, like I did all these main platforms. But since all the platforms are in place, I'm just going to drag this about where it needs to go. And that should be fine. So let me drag this in just a little bit. Now I want this toxic waste to be just a little bit transparent in the game so it looks like a liquid. So in the toxic waste actor, I'm going to double click that. Under its color settings, I'm going to change its alpha. I'm going to change that to 0.5. I'm going to delete this one and drag in the new one that's been updated to be transparent. There we go. Now you can see the background behind that liquid, so it just looks a little more liquidy instead of a solid object. Now for a little variety in the player's experience, I want to drag this special platform right here so it's kind of like a bridge. It looks like a bridge over the toxic waste. And again, just like the toxic waste, I'm just going to drag that over. Get it about where it needs to go. And we'll run through and play test this, of course, as we go. So if something doesn't line up or if something doesn't work right, we can fix it at that point. But what I'm doing here is I want to introduce a couple basic elements to the player as they play through this game. They're going to get a safe introduction to the toxic waste here in the first level because there's going to be no way that you can fall into it. There's going to be no way to get hurt. But you'll see that it does exist. And you're also going to get an introduction to this special platform that later on is actually going to be moving. The bridges will be moving in levels 2 and 3 over the toxic waste. So the player is going to get a gentle introduction to that element, and then later on it's actually going to become a little more dangerous. Now over here, on this platform right here, I want to place the key that the player is going to have to pick up. So I'm going to select that, drag it in. I'm just going to place that right about there. And all its behaviors are already set up, so all we have to do is place it on screen at this point. Then over here, in this empty space, I'm going to put some toxic waste in there as well. Just going to drag that over like I did in the first version of it. And that's really just to break up the scenery so the player isn't just seeing this repeating pattern over and over and over again. It's nice to have some different visual elements as you move through the level to make the experience a little bit varied. And we also need to add the door to let the player get out. So I'm going to drag one of the red buttons right here, and I'm going to place that on the floor right about there. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to hold down Option and copy that. And I'm going to use the rotate handle here and rotate it around. I'm holding Shift to constrain my rotation. If I didn't hold Shift down, I could rotate it to any direction I want. But I want to constrain that. Then drag it up. So it looks like these two buttons are going to be making the force field that make the door. So with that in mind, let's drag in the door's beam. Just going to place that right about here. I'm going to drag that up, again, to touch the buttons and fill out the effect of a force field. Now that's going to be our door. That's going to be working already too because we've set up all the behaviors for that. So once the game gets going, it's just going to function. Now let's go back to the start of the level. Let's place our player on there. Drag him in. I'm just going to drop it right here. If I were to preview this right now, in fact, let's preview that. You'll see it doesn't look like it's working right. And it is, it just doesn't look like it is. And I'll tell you that we have to make one change to the player to get this working just right. In the player, we want to double click him. We need to add a new behavior. And the behavior we need to add is the control camera behavior. I'm going to drag that in, put it right up at the top. And what that's going to do is it's always going to focus the camera on the player. So if I preview this now, the camera now focuses on the player. You can see him on screen. Still not quite right because he's all the way up at the top. So let's go back and make one more change. In the scene, we need to click this camera button right here. And then what that's going to do is give us control of the camera's view. I want to bring this view all the way into the center, as tight as it can be, and close this one down not quite all the way. So that's going to keep the camera focused right here to this center of the screen. And then when I click preview now, the player is a little bit lower down on screen. Now you can adjust that. If that doesn't fit your liking, you can go back and you can adjust this camera some more. You could bring this all the way down, even tighter. Re-preview that, and now it's down even lower on screen. So depending on how you want your game to function and how you want things to look, you can adjust the camera's view area. I want mine to be a little bit higher. So when I preview this now, I can jump. Background scrolling. I'm going to run through this level just as a quick run through to see, make sure things are working right, make sure the background doesn't scroll off. You can see the toxic waste up here. We didn't add our particle effects yet. We'll be adding those in just a minute. We also didn't add the alien droid yet. That'll be added shortly. I want to make sure, for one, that this player fits underneath this platform. If it was too low, I would hit my head and wouldn't be able to get through. I also want to make sure I can jump from here to there. So we do a little preliminary pre-testing. And that worked. I can get up there. It's not super easy. I missed it that one time. So, you know, it's up to you on how easy or difficult you want to make these jumps. But you can see I can make the jump, but it's also missable. So let me go up to the door. Now I can't get through there because you'll notice I did not pick up the key. So let's go back and pick up the key, make sure the door works like it's supposed to. There we go. It played the sound when I picked it up, just like we set up in the behaviors. We got the winning sound. The buttons turned green, the door turned green and disappeared. Now I can run down the hallway. Now we haven't set up the end of game trigger yet, so I can run all the way down the hallway, even past the backgrounds, and see my messy level construction. Now that's it for this tutorial. In the third tutorial, we're going to finish off the first level completely by adding the mean droid and getting it set up to hurt the player if they collide. We're going to add the user interface so you can see a score readout, a health readout, and you'll also be adding the key indicator if the player has picked up the key so they can get out of the level. And we'll also begin level 3. So I'll see you back here for the third installment of this tutorial series.